Of all King Henry VIII's wives, none perhaps met a more tragic fate than young Katherine Howard. Barely out of childhood, naive and starved of affection, she was thrust into a court full of danger, manipulation, and betrayal. She would become queen, but only for a fleeting moment, before the executioner's axe fell once again. Before the crown, before the scandal, before the axe, there was only a little girl, lost in the shadows of a crumbling noble house. Katherine Howard was born into a world that looked golden from a distance, but up close, it was all splinters and dust. Though she came from one of the most powerful families in England, the Howard name couldn't save her from a childhood marked by neglect and absence. Her grandfather was the mighty Thomas Howard, the second Duke of Norfolk, a man who had served 4 English kings with pride and distinction. But Katherine was not his heir. She was only the daughter of his 3rd son, Edmund Howard, a man better known for wasting money than earning it. Edmund had no head for business, no estate to pass down, and no strong position at court. He gambled, he borrowed, and he left his growing family in the hands of chance. Katherine's mother, Joyce Culpeper, had already been married once before. She brought with her 5 children from her first husband and would go on to have 6 more with Edmund. Katherine, likely the 8th of Joyce's 11 children, arrived into a home that was already stretched thin. No one is entirely sure when Katherine was born. Most believe it was between 1521 and 1523. Probably in Lambeth. She was a noble by blood but not by fortune. The Howard name carried weight, but the Howard purse was empty. When Katherine was still very young, perhaps only 5 or 6, her mother died. Her father, hopeless as ever, remarried twice but could never provide real security. Soon after Joyce's death, Edmund sought help from his more successful relatives. He wrote to Anne Boleyn, his niece and the rising star at court who would soon become queen herself, and managed to secure a position for himself in Calais. But it meant leaving his children behind. The family was broken up. The elder daughters were married off with modest dowries scraped together from favors and family connections. As for Katherine, she was sent away to be raised in the household of Agnes Tilney, the Dowager Duchess of Norfolk, her step-grandmother. It might sound like a step up, but in truth, it was anything but. Agnes was a respected matron at court, but she spent more time among royalty than she did watching over the many children in her care. Katherine became just one more ward in a crowded household of distant cousins and half-siblings, divided between the Duchess's properties at Chesworth House in Sussex and Norfolk House in Lambeth. In such a busy, barely supervised household, the lines between play and danger often blurred. Katherine received little formal education and even less guidance. Her childhood was not filled with lessons or love, but with long days, absent guardians, and a slow, quiet hunger for affection. And so, the seeds of her fate were sown, not in courtly intrigue or royal ambition, but in a little girl's loneliness. With Frances Dereham gone to Ireland and her affair buried beneath polite silence, Katherine's path seemed momentarily clear. But in Tudor England, the past has sharp edges, and the court never forgets. By 1539, the Howard family saw a fresh opportunity. Their niece, young, beautiful, and unspoiled in the public eye, could be placed at court. Not for her benefit, of course, but for theirs. Her powerful uncle, Thomas Howard, the 3rd Duke of Norfolk, maneuvered her into the household of King Henry VIII's new wife, Anne of Cleves. At first, Katherine's role was small, just another maid of honor. But her youth and charm didn't go unnoticed for long, especially by the aging king. By now, Henry was far from the golden prince he once had been. He was bloated, plagued by a festering leg wound that oozed pus and smelled terrible. His heart was failing, his temper unpredictable, his loneliness consuming. And then, there she was, Katherine Howard, smiling sweetly, curtsying low, never once flinching at the sight or smell of him. Unlike Anne of Cleves, who had recoiled when first meeting him, Katherine played her part flawlessly. She flattered him, laughed at his jokes, pretended not to notice the stink or the sores. To Henry, it was intoxicating. Here was a girl who made him feel young again. To many at court, the flirtation was obvious. The king began sending her small gifts. Jewels, silk, even properties. By the early summer of 1540, Henry was visiting her in secret, rowed across the Thames under cover of night to Lambeth Palace, where she was staying. Soon, the whispers turned to certainty. Anne of Cleves, ever pragmatic, understood exactly what was happening. She didn't love Henry, perhaps she never did, and so, when the king sought to annul their marriage, she made no protest. On July 12, 1540, Henry's marriage to Anne was officially annulled, and only 16 days later, on July 28, he married Katherine Howard in a quiet ceremony at Oatlands Palace. The king was 49. Katherine was likely no older than 17. Her rise had been rapid, glittering, and dangerous. She was now Queen of England, but she was still a girl, and no one, not the Duchess, not her uncle, not the king, had prepared her for what that truly meant. No coronation was planned. That would come later, if she gave the king a son. But behind the silks and sapphires, Katherine remained the same lonely, neglected child she'd always been. The girl who had once called a man husband in secret. The girl who knew how to smile and pretend. And somewhere, far from court, Frances Dereham was watching, and waiting. She had risen higher than she ever dreamed, but the walls of a palace do not keep secrets. They echo them. Katherine Howard was queen. The crown may have been metaphorical, there was no grand coronation, but the title was real. And so were the expectations. At court, she was now Her Majesty, Queen Catherine. She had fine gowns sewn with gold thread. Jewels from foreign lands sparkled on her fingers. Her chambers were attended by noblewomen. And the king, grey, groaning, and smelling of rot, came to her rooms almost every night. But no child quickened in her womb. Henry, now in his late 40s and plagued by illness, had begun to believe, if only in secret, that the failure might not be Catherine's. Whispers of infertility had followed him since Anne Boleyn's trial, and though Jane Seymour had given him Edward, she had died before proving it wasn't a miracle. Still, he loved Catherine, or at least believed he did. He called her his very jewel of womanhood. He showered her with gifts. He indulged her every whim. And Catherine? She did what she'd always done. She smiled, she curtsied, she flattered, she danced, she wore dresses that dazzled like frost in morning light. But beneath the silks and sapphires, she remained the same girl who had never truly been wanted. She tried to be kind. She used her new power to help others, petitioning for the release of prisoners, ensuring an old noblewoman in the Tower had warm clothes for winter. She made small mercies matter. But her sweetness did not win over everyone. Princess Mary, Henry's daughter, was 9 years older than her new stepmother, and not impressed. To Mary, Catherine was a shallow, empty-headed girl obsessed with clothes and dancing. A girl with no education, no depth, no faith. Even at court, some nobles whispered that Catherine lacked the grace and caution expected of a queen. Her appetite for fashion, jewels, and attention was seen by some as vulgar. They compared her, often unfairly, to Anne Boleyn, forgetting that Anne had once been dismissed in much the same way. And then, in the autumn of 1541, the past returned. Frances Dereham, long silent, reappeared at court. He had heard the rumors. He had read the proclamations. And now, Katherine Howard, the girl who had once promised herself to him in whispers, was Queen of England. He came to her household quietly, recommended by Agnes Tilney herself. But his presence was anything but quiet. He took up a role as one of Catherine's private secretaries, and though he kept his voice low and his behavior formal in front of others, he was far too familiar with her in private. Those close to the Queen noticed. They gossiped. They speculated. Some grew jealous. Others grew suspicious. Catherine panicked. She knew what Francis knew, what he could say, what he might claim, and most dangerously, what might be true. To silence him, or perhaps to control the narrative, she kept him close. But in doing so, she brought a loaded match into a room already filled with smoke. And that wasn't the only fire burning. Thomas Culpeper, a handsome and charming courtier, had caught Catherine's eye. Their flirtation had begun before her marriage, when she was still just a maid of honor. But now, it bloomed dangerously in secret. They exchanged glances, then letters, then meetings. Culpeper was everything Henry was not: young, witty, smooth-faced, and bold, and Katherine, still so young, so emotionally starved, could not help herself. She knew the risks. She'd seen what had happened to Anne Boleyn. But desire has its own logic, and Katherine was not the careful, calculating queen others had been. She was a girl with a crown on her head and fire in her heart. And no one to warn her. Soon, the meetings became more frequent, longer, hidden behind locked doors, guarded by her lady-in-waiting, Jane Boleyn, widow of Anne Boleyn's executed brother. And as these two men, Francis Dereham and Thomas Culpeper, drifted dangerously close to the Queen's orbit, those who envied the Howards watched, waited, took notes. The past, it seemed, was not content to be buried. And the Queen of England was walking ever closer to the edge. The court was quiet, but not still. It listened, it remembered, and then, it whispered. In the summer of 1541, Queen Catherine and King Henry VIII embarked on a royal progress through the north of England. It was meant to be a show of strength and unity, a tour of loyalty after years of rebellion and doubt. But back at court, not everyone was loyal, and not everyone was silent. It began with a man named John Lascelles, a minor courtier with a sharp sense of justice and an axe to grind. His sister, Mary Hall, had once served in the household of the Dowager Duchess of Norfolk. She had known Catherine as a young girl, known the secrets whispered behind heavy curtains at Chesworth House. When John suggested Mary seek a position with the Queen, she refused. "She is light in living," Mary said. "I have seen things I cannot unsee." And so, John did the one thing that would change Catherine's fate forever. He went to Archbishop Thomas Cranmer, the highest churchman in England, and told him the Queen had not been a virgin when she married the king. It was not yet a crime, but it was more than enough to begin an inquiry. Cranmer was no fool. He knew that to accuse the Queen of moral failure, even before marriage, was to challenge the king's judgment. Henry, after all, had fallen completely, blindly in love with Catherine. Unlike Anne Boleyn, whom he had tired of and turned against, he still adored this young, vibrant bride. So Cranmer tread carefully. When the royal progress reached Hampton Court Palace in late October, Cranmer did something bold, but quiet. While Henry prayed alone in his private chapel, Cranmer slipped him a letter. A letter that contained everything. The king read it, and did not speak. He did not rage, he did not cry. Instead, he handed it back and asked the archbishop to investigate further, but said nothing to Catherine. He would not see her again, not even once. Catherine, meanwhile, knew nothing. She was dancing with her ladies when the guards arrived. The music stopped, her friends were sent away, and the Queen of England was placed under house arrest in her chambers, with only Lady Jane Boleyn by her side. At first, Catherine refused food. She trembled, she wept, but she still held out hope. Surely Henry would come. He loved her. If she could only speak to him, see him face to face, he would understand. But Henry did not come. And the silence grew louder. Cranmer questioned Mary Hall again. Then he found others, maids and attendants from the Duchess's household, who confirmed the rumors. There had been touching promises, nights spent in bed with Francis Dereham. Some claimed there had been vows spoken in secret, which could mean, by law, that Catherine was already married before she married the king. The Queen's defenders dwindled. Even her relatives, the powerful Howards, began to quietly distance themselves. The king, meanwhile, wept before his council. He was not just angry. He was humiliated, and humiliation was something Henry VIII never forgave. Still, there was no conclusive proof of adultery, not yet. Until Cranmer learned that Katherine herself had brought Francis Dereham into her private household after her marriage. He was not just her former lover. He was now a royal employee. That changed everything. The council ordered his arrest. Under questioning, Dereham confessed to the relationship, but claimed it had ended before she became queen. He insisted they had once intended to marry, but denied ever touching her after she wed Henry. But the damage was done. Intentions were enough. Appearances were enough. And as Cranmer pushed harder, Katherine broke. She confessed that yes, there had been a relationship. But then she said something no one expected. Francis Dereham had forced himself upon her. A desperate move, maybe even a lie. But it was too late. Her story kept shifting, and the council no longer believed her. And then came Thomas Culpeper. Catherine Tilney, one of Catherine's ladies, recalled something strange: late-night visits, long hours behind closed doors, and Jane Boleyn standing guard. Another maid had heard whispers and laughter. Another had seen letters. One swore she'd seen the Queen gazing longingly out the window at Culpeper, calling him, "my little fool." Finally, Culpeper himself was arrested, and when pressed, he broke. He admitted they had met in secret. He confessed to feelings, to flirtations, to letters, but, he insisted, they had never actually slept together. Katherine, too, held fast to that story. Even as everything collapsed around her, she insisted she had not been unfaithful to the king. But by now, it didn't matter. The trap had closed, the charges had been drafted, and the Queen of England, who once danced in silk and rubies, now wore plain wool in a locked room, with only shadows for company. Her fate would not be decided by love, nor truth, nor mercy. It would be decided by power. By the time Katherine understood the danger, the wheel had already begun to turn, and it would not stop, not for tears, not for truth, not even for love. The King's Council moved swiftly. Francis Dereham and Thomas Culpeper were imprisoned and interrogated. The charge was treason, and the penalty, if proven, was death. Dereham, perhaps knowing he would not be believed, admitted to the relationship with Katherine but claimed it had ended long before her marriage. He denied being part of any conspiracy, denied speaking to her as queen in any inappropriate way. But the council was no longer interested in subtle truths. They wanted guilt, they wanted betrayal, and most of all, they wanted someone to pay. Culpeper's testimony was more careful. He admitted they had met in secret, that they had written to each other, that they were in love. But he, too, denied that their relationship had been consummated. Still, under Tudor law, even the intent to commit adultery with the Queen was enough to hang a man. And so it was decided. On December 10, 1541, Thomas Culpeper was executed, beheaded quickly. A grim kindness. Francis Dereham, by contrast, was sentenced to the most brutal fate reserved for traitors: hanged, drawn, and quartered, a public and agonizing death meant to send a message. Their heads were placed on pikes above London Bridge. Katherine, locked away and stripped of her royal status, received the news with quiet horror. But worse was still to come. The law, at least, the law as it stood, didn't actually allow for her execution. She had not been proven to commit adultery after her marriage. No court had tried her. There was no formal confession of guilt beyond youthful indiscretions. So Parliament passed a new law. Retroactively, it declared that any queen who failed to disclose her sexual history to the king within 20 days of marriage was guilty of treason. It also made it a crime for a queen to encourage or incite others to commit adultery with her. This law had never existed before. It existed only for her. The trap was now legal. The acts, lawful. And yet, the girl at the center of it all still hoped. In January of 1542, Cranmer returned to question her one last time. This time, he did not yell. He brought with him a letter, from Henry himself, promising mercy if she spoke the truth. Katherine broke down in tears. She confessed to loving Culpeper. She confessed to foolishness. But she maintained, again and again, that she had never crossed the final line. That her meetings with him, while dangerous, had never become physical. It didn't matter. The council had already decided she was guilty. Jane Boleyn, her lady-in-waiting and accomplice, had confessed to guarding the door while Culpeper visited the Queen's chamber late into the night. The household maids whispered of noises and sighs and letters passed in secret. One maid remembered seeing Katherine staring out of a window, longing for someone below. Culpeper, she said, he was the one. Truth blurred with rumor, memory with suspicion, and in the end, perception became judgment. Katherine was stripped of all her jewels and fine clothes. The ring that once belonged to Anne of Cleves, the one Henry had given her, was taken from her hand. Her royal seal was revoked. And on February 10, she was told she would die. Not someday, not in theory, in 3 days. She asked for the block to be brought to her room, not out of fear, but practice. Over and over again, she placed her head upon it, trying to still the trembling in her limbs. She was only 17. On the morning of February 13, 1542, Katherine Howard was led from her cell in the Tower of London. She wore a plain black dress. Her face was pale, but composed. She walked to the scaffold at Tower Green, where her cousin Anne Boleyn had died just 5 years earlier. With a trembling voice, she addressed the crowd. "I die a queen, but I would rather have died the wife of Culpeper." Or perhaps she said something else. History is unclear, but the meaning remains the same. She died young, and in love, and alone. The axe fell, once, clean. Jane Boleyn, her loyal lady-in-waiting, perhaps out of guilt, perhaps out of truth, followed soon after. She had descended into madness while imprisoned. But Henry had changed the law to allow her execution anyway. He wanted them both gone. The court moved on. The palace floors were scrubbed. The musicians played again, and Henry VIII began to consider his 6th wife. But the ghost of Katherine Howard would linger. In the long corridors of Hampton Court Palace, where she once ran, it is said her spirit remains, screaming, sobbing, begging for mercy as guards drag her away from the chapel where Henry knelt and pretended not to hear. He would outlive her, but never forget her. And England would never quite forgive him. She was never meant to be a queen. She was barely more than a child. And yet the crown found her, and so did the blade. Katherine Howard did not leave behind letters of philosophy. She had no children, no throne room of her own, no sweeping reform to etch her name in marble. She left behind only whispers. And yet, centuries later, we still remember her, not as a monarch, but as a mirror, of girlhood, of longing, of what happens when affection is withheld and power is misplaced. She had no guidance, no real education, no anchor in a stormy court. In another life, in another century, Katherine might have been the girl next door. A bright smile, a good heart, a teenager who made foolish choices in search of love. But she was born a Howard. And a Howard girl, no matter how naive, was always a piece on someone else's chessboard. The men who raised her up, her uncle, her grandfather's widow, the king himself, did not do so because they believed in her. They did so because she was useful. And when her usefulness ended, so did her life. She was not the first young woman to die for the sins of others. And she would not be the last. Some historians call her reckless. Others say she was foolish. But more and more, we see her now for what she truly was. A lonely child who had never been properly loved. Trying to survive in a world that mistook need for sin, and curiosity for crime. Even in death, her legacy was smothered. No official portrait survives, no tombstone bears her name alone. She lies beneath the stones of St. Peter ad Vincula, in the Tower of London. Beside her cousin Anne Boleyn, two young queens who died by the same axe. In the same place, for the same king. And yet, her echo lingers. In ghost stories whispered through the halls of Hampton Court. In stage plays and novels and quiet classroom lessons. In the quiet understanding of every young woman who has ever loved unwisely. In every daughter who searched for tenderness in all the wrong places, because no one had shown her where to look. And in one little girl named Elizabeth, barely 8 years old, who reportedly liked her cheerful stepmother, and who, upon hearing of Catherine's fate, declared, "I will never marry." She never did. That little girl would grow up to be Elizabeth I, England's Virgin Queen. A woman who ruled alone. Who never forgot what a crown could cost. Katherine Howard died at 17. She never ruled. She left no heir. But she left a warning. A whisper in history. A plea echoing from the past. Love your daughters, listen to them, teach them what power can do, and never, ever forget them.